Alright. Herzlich willkommen. My name is Sabine von Mehring and I welcome you on behalf of the Center for German and European Studies at Brandeis University to our 10th CGS online webinar. Here in the United States, we continue to wrestle with multiple crises. Not only do numbers for COVID-19 infections continue to rise in many states or even start rising again, but there has also been yet another murder of a Black man by police. Just this past Friday, Rayshard Brooks was shot by police in Atlanta, and the circumstances of Brooks' death not only explain why the movement for Black Lives is calling to defund police and use our tax dollars in a more sensible way than militarized equipment and force to oppress, kill, and incarcerate Black people. More importantly, why wasn't he left alone to sleep, given that it seemed to be the right thing to do if indeed he had had too much alcohol? I don't believe I would risk arrest if the police found me sleeping in my car. But it's also another example of the importance of holding police accountable, which in this case, like in several of the recent cases, is possible only because it is all on camera. And of course, we know how many more cases there must be which are not. According to statistics published on the web, more than 1,000 people were killed in 2019 in this country. Black people disproportionately so. This leads many, of course, to ask what other countries, like Germany, for example, where such numbers are significantly lower, are doing differently. And what forms of racism and racist violence may be taking there if it does not show itself so blatantly in murders by police. Because of course we know racism itself is not a uniquely American problem. In the context of COVID-19, we have also seen a significant rise in domestic violence. And my colleague Joachim Kersten has spent his professional life studying all these issues. And I'm very grateful for his willingness to talk to us today. Before I introduce him more properly, I wanted to also let you know that our program co-sponsored by the Goethe Institute this coming Thursday has changed in response to Black Lives Matter protests. Sasha Mariana Salzman and Guy Benaron have asked two Black artists, Rebecca Einwohner from Germany and Ariane Roach from the US, to join them for a conversation they are calling Art in the Time of Uprisings. So I very much hope that you will be able to join us again on Thursday at noon right here on Zoom. Next Monday, we will then be hosting Andy Georgiou, who will talk to us about Germany's investments in fossil gas. Not exactly the work of a climate champion. More details on these and other upcoming events on our website, and also the recordings will be there at brandeis.edu/CGES. And please do use the chat if you wish to ask a question. We will unmute you to ask your question out loud during the Q&A, unless you specifically tell us not to. And if there are procedural questions or technical questions that you have in between, just ask them and I'll try to interrupt Joachim to tell him to give us an answer. So our guest today is Professor Joachim Kersten. He studied science, history, and politics at the Free University Berlin and at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He holds a doctorate from the University of Tübingen and a postdoctoral degree from the University of Konstanz. He has written numerous books and journal articles on juvenile prison, youth crime, gendered violence, and police accountability, police and minorities. He has taught in Australia, in Japan, in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and also here in the United States, where he was professor for German and political science at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. After 2007, he was professor and chair at the German Police University in Münster and is currently senior research professor at the Criminology Department of the German Police University which is a graduate school for German and European police leadership. In that capacity, he is leading EU Horizon 2020 research on improving first-line responders strategies concerning incidents of high-impact domestic violence. So please welcome Joachim Kersten.
Thank you, Sabine. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Good. Okay,
So
wonderful.
now you can share your screen.
We go back actually quite a while because Sabine and we met during a German teachers something. And since we have been in contact, and I've been invited to Brandeis, fortunately, a number of times, and I always liked it very much there. I feel this is my first online webinar lecture, and it's a bit awkward because I like to see the faces of the people who are forced to listen to me, and then I can see whether they are with me or not. So this is more difficult today. So I'll have to trust that you will be interested. And if you fall asleep, I can't hear you. So I have prepared a presentation. Now the structure of my talk is to begin with policing, look at comparative analysis of American and German policing, look at the root causes of racism more in Germany than in the US, because I think you all know about it, probably more than I do. And then in the end, we look at this domestic violence project, which is run with 8 countries, 8 European countries, and we have some findings. So I have some to start. There we go. Is it there?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm going to hide myself, okay? Or do you want to see me fall asleep? No, I'm not falling asleep. I'm going to hide myself so that people can see you well. Okay?
Now, next, this is, as you can see here, it's not a misspelling. Polizei used to be spelled with E-Y, and it was not the uniform police. It referred to public administration in general. So everything that was run by the state before the German Empire was founded was called Polizei, and it actually meant that the state servants, the public officers, should be good and should be qualified to deal with the public, similar to a little bit to the situation in Japan. Here we have a class of police from Hamburg in the 19th century, early 20th century, and this is Germany's future. You see, this is die Pickelhaube, which is the helmet was the helmet of German police. Here's the Prussian eagle, and so it means the suppression of people who are here under the helmet and who cannot move. Police was not seen as, in the slides before, as someone being very caring for people. They have been suppressing workers' revolts like they did in New York and elsewhere. So this is again a class of police officers wearing this helmet. And this is 1920s, the Weimar Republic, which was a time when police reforms were started. And there was the first international police exhibition in Germany, and it was attended by many people from all over the world. It was seen as a reforming of police, being more intelligent, being less suppressive. This is a police car, which is an old Mercedes. This is from an exhibition. I'll talk about that in a second. Now here we have a German SR officer, SR man. He was not an officer. The Sturmabteilung, that was before the SS, the Nazi guards, the militia, and a police officer, and of course the German Schäferhund, the dog. And they look grim, and they probably were. And then after the 39, when the war started, police was immediately aligned with SS. Himmler was in charge of police and SS. So police officers were actually forced to join the SS. This is the exhibition that I mentioned about 5 years ago about the role of German police during the Nazi period. Was attended by 55,000 people in the Deutsches Historisches Museum, German Historical Museum in Berlin. So I have to tell this about the German police because it is important to understand why the accusation of racism or even structural racism is something that really hits and causes a lot of, stirs people up and gets very severe responses from, particularly of course from police, but also from others. There's no denying that police was the central actor of the Shoah, murdering 6 million Jews, and Sinti Roma, millions of Soviet war prisoners. Roma, Sinti, the minorities, forced workers in the occupied countries. They did not only participate in Nazism, they organized the killings. The transports, for example, to the death camps was done by German police, by patrol police, uniform police. The main rupture of German policing after Weimar reform was this period of German policing from 33 to 45. What happened after 45 was a denial of guilt and responsibility. And because the Allies needed police, particularly the Western Allies, in their fight against communism, they put former Nazi officers back into positions, because under the Nazis, there were successful communist hunters and socialists and sort of how to fight the labor unions. And this lasted into the 70s, when ex-Nazi police officers were police leaders in post-war German police in the West. And among them were officers who were responsible for war crimes. So that took a long time to come to the surface. Here we have post-West and East Germany, the GDR and the Federal Republic. This is a picture that has an interesting history, because I was asked to give a presentation on German police education at an international police conference in Shanghai, China. And I arrived there and got into my little room there in the college, and I have been there before, so I was very happy. And then I looked at the program. I had a teddy bear, a male uniform teddy bear, and the conference program, but my name was not on the program. So they simply censored me, but they sent my presentation to Beijing, to the internal censors there for the Ministry of Interior. I was no one suddenly, which was an interesting position, since I've never been invited again. But it must have been these pictures. This is, going back, sorry. Where are we? There. These are East German Volkspolizei, People's Police. These are West Berlin police. And this is a woman, and why she's kneeling, I don't really know. But you see the border then was just this chalk line separating the people in Berlin. Sabine has been to Berlin, and now you can't see this anymore. These are East German workers and East German officers from the border troops or from the police, and this is a West Berlin police officer. So this is when they were building the wall. This is how Berlin was divided. So there were some important ruptures in the East, and that was the crushing of the workers' protest. Maybe that was what the Chinese didn't like so much. In 1953, together with Soviet tanks, the Stasi surveillance of East German population, actually the Stasi, which is the secret, not the secret police, but the Staatssicherheitspolizei, the state security police, which is exactly the term also for the Chinese police, they had more agents and sort of, I just know the prison term, people sniffing out the neighborhood, reporting to them, fueling information to them, where Jews were hidden, where people told Hitler jokes and so on. They had more of these in their force than the Nazis had. I mean, this is important to to acknowledge, because it was a police state, and of course it was a dictatorship, East Germany. 1989 was the end of the German Democratic Republic and also of the Volkspolizei, a very sudden end, and that led to problems, which I'm not going to describe in detail. In the West, the ruptures were the crushing of workers' protests in the 50s, crushing of the student protest movement in the late 60s, and then the environmental protests, Gorleben, Frankfurt Airport, Wackersdorf, Stuttgart. These were large demonstrations, many people, and the police were seen to act there out of line and beating and using their truncheons. So the German, post-West German police organized in a society that used to be a society based on fear and then became a society based on conformity. The police was the pillar of the authoritarian state, and after the reforms, which interestingly started not from above, which is normally the case in Germany, but they started within the police organization themselves. Younger officers, for example, pointed out that some of their leaders were ex-Nazis, and they wanted a more democratic and service-oriented organization which they've managed to install over the decades. There are still lots of problems which I will cover later. However, you know, the Germans in uniform are sort of absolutely necessary for Hollywood. You may have seen the most terrible film is Top Secret by the Zucker brothers, where they just put East German police into Nazi uniforms. It's a comedy, by the way, and it's actually quite funny. But the German man in uniform is an icon of our past, but it has very little to do with what police is doing right now. There's a Finnish scholar, a colleague of mine, Kersten, I hope I pronounce it correctly. He has compared 16 countries and trust in police. And then Germany is quite close to the Scandinavian countries, which have the highest ratings in trust of police. And the other variables that he pointed out that have to do with trust in police, that people trust the police, is education, a fair social welfare system, not a large kluft, what is it, Sabine? A large shift, a large canyon between the rich and the poor, and transparency. So this, you can apply this to the present. This is certainly not what we have right now. These things that Kersten points out, equal income, equality, empathy for the poor, empathy for the discriminated, and so these are the kinds of things that we don't have too much in our country. So these are the German Länder, from north to south, and each of them, that is a consequence of the time after the Nazi regime ended, is a federal. So each of the Länder, we have federal police, but each of the Länder are in charge, A, for education, universities, schools, B, for police. So when we come to a decision in the German Police University, which is here in Münster, the representatives of all Länder police have to agree on these things. So it's sometimes complicated, but it also has some advantages. They didn't want the German police to become this monolithic, powerful organization like the French police now, from top to bottom, and sort of built on Gehorsam and a chain of command, which goes from the top to the bottom. Bronze is the lowest rank of police. In some of the Länder, they don't have that anymore. They have only silver stars, but the bronze education takes 2.5 to 3 years. It's practical training. Sorry, I have to go back. And the silver star, which is Kommissar, Kommissarin, is a BA now, after Bologna reforms, 2.5 to 3 years at police colleges. So it's a study with some practical elements. And the gold stars are the Rat und Rätin, which is the highest ranks of detectives and patrol That's the MA program where I taught from 2007 until 2014. It takes 2 years. The first year is at the police colleges of the Länder and the second year in Münster. The German Police University is funded by federal and Länder governments. It is a sort of state university, but it's not like like Tübingen or Konstanz or Hamburg, but it is a university. So we have PhD students and so on. The numbers are 100 to 200. At the moment, we have 250. A very strict selection procedure. The entire gold star, sort of the top management of German police, is less than 2% of the entire workforce. So that tells you that this is a very small selection of students. The university has 10 professors and 7 senior police instructors, which were not always happy with me. God bless them. The MA thesis is compulsory to enter the rank of the top management. Now comes the comparison. Am I good in terms of time? I am good.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, looking at the history. And so you have US here and Germany. History, localized militia, slave hunting was part in the South. It was urban police, and it represented the white mainstream in the United States. In Germany, it was an authoritarian. Peel is the reformer of the British police. British police was the model of policing for the people, not against the people, policing with the people. So that's the Peel model. And you could call the American model and certainly parts of the German model the anti-Peel. So it's not to take the skin away, but it's the anti-Peel model of policing. So the historical burden in the US is the involvement in racism, racist killings. There are postcards of police officers taking part in lynching, brutalities also against whites during the protests, for example, in the 60s civil rights movement, and so on. The Nazi responsibility for the Shoah and the murder of minority people, I've already pointed that out. Turning points in the US, the one that I have looked up is Screws versus United States, where a man was beaten to pulp by police, and then it went through different courts, and in the end, they were acquitted. And Selma, Alabama, 1965, Watts, Chicago, you can put the names there. The chain is long and terrible, and I think the last incidents add to this chain. In 1952, in Germany, there was a killing of a young worker during a demonstration. 68, killing of a student. And then there were Wackersdorf, which environmental protests, Stuttgart 21, environmental, but nobody was killed there, but there were injuries, of course. They used tear gas and truncheons. And NSU is Nationalsozialistischer Untergrund, is a right-wing or not fascist, it's a Nazi terrorist organization, more or less run as far as we know, but they were supporters by 3 people from young people from East Germany, and they killed 11 migrants, and the police failed to investigate this correctly, and they failed to stop it, and they failed to come up with a good explanation why they really, there's no other word for it, screwed up the entire investigation. The numbers of police in the US are about 750,000 in 25,000 police organizations. In Germany, you have 250,000, a little bit more by now, in 16 Länder and 3 federal police organizations. Violent crime that may surprise some, but not those who are informed about criminology. In my country and in your country, violent crime goes down, not up. It's called the fear of crime paradoxon. While crime goes down, reporting goes up and fear of crime goes up. But if you look at the numbers, it looks different. Victims of police shootings in the US, it's estimated to 1,000 to 1,500 per annum, per year. In Germany in 2019, there were 14 deaths by police. But there were years in the last in the last 2 decades where nobody was shot by police, or 1 or maybe 2. And these incidents are very, very carefully investigated. So the opponents having weapons, firearms, the likelihood in the US, I would say, is significant. In Germany, on the whole, it is very low, particularly if you go to the Black Forest or parts of Bavaria. But there are urban hotspots where police officers were shot, like Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg. And there were incidents in the last months, I think, where police was shot at. Training education, this is on average. I know that in cities like Chicago or New York, John Jay College, it takes longer. There is a BA and MA program, but on average, it's 20+ weeks. And for what is absolutely unbelievable for me is that in some parts of the United States, you can get the star and the gun, and then within the next year, you have to take the course. So you are actually allowed to confront people with a deadly weapon without having any training, skills, controls, and so on. This is very different from us. In an interview, I said it's a different universe. You know, it's beyond our sort of horizon to imagine that someone can use a police gun and use the authority of a uniform or of a badge without having training. Firearm training objective is, when I'm not totally mistaken, to hurt and incapacitate in the US. And there is this one guy, Grossman, who calls himself a killologist. And of course, on YouTube, you can see him teaching. This is clearly teaching to use the firearm to kill. The overall development in the last 20 years in the US is clearly militarization, and 20% of cops now are ex-soldiers. And it's not just ex-soldiers, it's soldiers who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they have seen opponents with dark color of skin and looking differently. So somebody who looks different, who is sort of the other, is seen as a threat, and it may have contributed to the escalation and the impression that some of us have that American police is a little bit too trigger happy, so they shoot too fast. The emphasis here is very much on verbal skills. So in German it says, die stärkste Waffe des Polizisten und der Polizistin ist das gesprochene Wort, the spoken word. And the training is, I have taken part, is interactive in studios, and the objective is not to kill. So even in situations where officers may feel threatened, they learn over the course of, well, if you add it up, it's 2.5 plus 2.5, and then in the end, 3 years. Of course, they have no longer gun training in the end, but they have maybe at least 3 years of doing this weekly, fortnightly, to learn to stand and see somebody jumping out behind a wall or jumping out behind a car or whatever, having something in his hand, and to discriminate whether this is a deadly weapon or this is not threatening their lives. So systemic structural racism in society that has been raised in the discussion now with the new deaths. Of course, it has been raised here. I think we can discuss this later on when we have time to discuss this. I don't know why it always jumps back to probably I'm touching something. Oh dear. Was the wrong way around. See, I'm a bit nervous because I can't see your faces, so it makes me nervous.
You're doing fine.
Thank you, Sabine. You always have a calming effect on me. So this comparison is sort of handmade in the last 3 days. It probably has flaws, and it's not a scholarly piece, but it's just something that I did to sort of compare. Does the mainstream acknowledge social inequality, injustice, and racism? I think that we can discuss. Are there cuts in public health, social services in the US? Yes. In Germany, yes. Do police work in fields for which they are not qualified and very often also not motivated because it's seen as female work? Cleaning up things, talking like to children, talking to very irate people, calming them down, dealing with people who are inebriated. That is not seen as sort of the kind of masculine crime fighting kind of job, but as sort of, the work of wives, housewives and women. Of course, which is of course a very stupid stereotype, but what I want to say I think that was reported very often here, that in the present situation, police in the US has to do all kinds of things because the social services are no longer there or not available 24/7. And so they are doing things for which they are not trained and which they may not very much like to do. What happens when you criticize police, when you expose misconduct, brutalities, and when there is bad press? The dogma of infallibility and the siege mentality, the blue wall of science in both countries, knee-jerking denial of things, particularly from superiors and the unions. And then even now, when you have the video coverage, some of them try to deny and say, "Oh, you can't see what they have done before," and so on. I think it's what's the famous African American actor? He said, "There's not more violence; it's just filmed now."
Right.
Which I think is probably, I think the incidents that have happened in the last 10 years are very serious. There is a rise of populist ideologies and parties, yes, in your country, yes, in my country. There is extremism, racism, incidents and officer attitudes and activities, yes, yes. Civilian oversight, working civilian oversight ombudsperson, no, in the US. There are cities that have oversight. In Germany, no. It has been something where the police unions, not all of them, but particularly the most conservative, have really run amok and try to out-Rambo each other, saying, if we have that kind of police control, police will no longer be able to do their job. We will have a rise in crime. All that has been done in criminology, Camden, New Jersey, and elsewhere, when you disable bad police, and when you sort of sack them, and then you rehire only those that have a good record, crime rather goes down. It doesn't go up, and trust in police goes up, and it doesn't go down. So, but regardless, the unions, of course, they have to do their job and protect their members and support them, but there are bastions of anti-police reform movement very clearly. Reconciliation. Why shouldn't there be a form of saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I did a wrong thing. I tried to make up, I tried to make good." Nothing in your country, nothing in my country. Reliable data, regular surveys, independent monitoring, no, why not? People are only interested in police when they watch I don't know, the naval, what is it? These TV series with a fake thing that show nothing about the reality of police work, just sort of entertaining. Yes, we have that. Police unions blocking reforms. We have a proportionality principle. That means police is asked when they have used violence, use of force, if it was proportional to the situation that they encountered. In the US, you have this legal principle of qualified immunity, which is seen, at least by some critics, as something that sort of supports the covering up of misconduct and not holding officers responsible for what they're doing. Trust in police, survey results, USA, high, Germany, high. Mainstream interest in actual reform of police law. So this was the comparison. And now, this is, it's always easy from outside to criticize other countries, other police, but this is the German thing. I run through this quite fast. I will send this to Sabine, so if you're interested, you can use this presentation. I have no objections. You can use that. We have misogynist, homophobic, racist, xenophobic attitudes among 10 to 15% of the population, and I guess it is probably the same percentage in the police organizations. I used to deny that, or not to believe that, or try to talk myself out of it. But given what has happened in the last 15 years, I'm more skeptical. There were chat groups, networks, sensible data, information was sent by police officers to right-wing groups, networks. There was use of racist language, expressing sympathy for right-wing sentiments, persons, connections to Reichsbürgerszene, a very strange thing. They believe that Germany is not legitimate, but that we still have Deutsches Reich, so what I showed you before. And so they hand in their passports. Very right-wing, very racist organizations. The aforementioned right-wing terror group, it's a complete police failure. Länder, it fits the definition of institutional racism because it's the collective failure to curb serial murders of migrants. The explanations for racism, xenophobia, is that police are more exposed to the new arrivals, to the migrants, to the refugees, and their problems in accommodation, in cultural adaptation, masculinity issues, crime, family conflict, conflict with people from other countries and cultures. I mean, things are not very nice sometimes in these places where the new arrivals are housed. Police are carrying a heavier burden, pretty much like medical service, social work, women's aid, but only but on a 24/7 availability basis. So they are confronted more with the problems of people from other cultures and other social background than other professions. So in sum, I would say the entire police organization is not racist, but there is a disquieting incidence of racist and right-wing persons and activities, and the failure to combat right-wing scenarios and activities. So we're getting to the end here. Social inequality, social injustice. This is again a comparison which struck me in surprise. Turks, refugees from Africa, Syria, and Iraq, they have lower income, lower educational standards, and more troublesome neighborhoods. The median income of Germans is 3,300 euros per month. Of migrants is 2,500, and a refugee and asylum applicants is 44% of the median income. So it is a large difference. However, in the US, the net income of average white family is 10 times higher than that of African-American families. I checked this, and it seems to be empirically proven. There is a higher incidence of domestic violence in the minority areas with the migrants, and non-Germans, even if they have a German passport, which many Turks have, and many people from other cultures have in the meantime, fortunately, they still feel, and if they have different color of skin, they feel over-policed and treated unfairly. Now, this is sort of the bright side, or what I think can be done. Corona has taught us which professions are important and are not enough respected and severely underpaid. This is the same for the US and Germany. Nursing staff, caregivers, food supply industry workers, transport workers, cleansing department workers. Who does this work in the US? African Americans and other minorities. In Germany, the Turks and other minority people. If you look in the street, who is collecting the garbage cans, who is doing this, who is serving in the restaurants, who is doing the jobs that have very low pay and which are very difficult and which are sometimes very dangerous, minority people. And they are underpaid, but they are essential, as we have just learned for our lives. And in the Federal Reserve in the US and German federal budget, there were capacities for enormous spending. German government flew back 250,000 people who were somewhere abroad, among them those passengers on the cruisers. They flew them back. They have to pay for it now, which is, I think, only fair. But what a colleague of mine suggests a new Green Deal, you know, the New Deal by Roosevelt, a new Green Deal, better wages for underpaid minority workers, clean energy, key sectors of sustainable economies, workers with little or no skills should work in urban improvement, jobs with basic wages, where they can acquire skills and competencies. I think that is a very meaningful suggestion. We are in the very end. So this is the domestic violence project. Do I still have 5 minutes, Sabine?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take your time.
Okay. So this is very difficult to get these research grants from the European Union. It took us 4 years of really writing and then rewriting and so on. Finally, we got it. And it's a 36 months project where we try to improve the response of first-line responders, which is the police and the medical profession and social services, social workers, victim services. And so we are doing research with these professions. We have done interviews, we have looked at their work in field studies, and we try to make, to improve the connection between them. Because they very often, to be frank, they don't talk to each other because they have ideas about the other's professions and what they do. And so we try to change this by training programs. We have a YouTube video for the public information. We will run one for people who are active, a training video, these kinds of things we do. This is the countries that participate: Finland, this is Hungary, Austria, Germany, France. It's just Scotland, it's not the entire UK, and Portugal. And these are the murders committed by partner in Europe. And you see it differs a lot between here, Romania and Northern Ireland and Greece. The southern countries, Spain, Italy, Greece, tend to have lower rates of femicide, as it's called, when a female is killed by her partner. That is survey data of women since age 14 who have been victimized in domestic violence, 35, 37, Denmark 55. This, again, in the South, it's lower. This is a very high rate. This can be only one incident in a lifetime, but it is still the fact that most women have been victimized. Over the last 12 months, we have 13 million victimizations per annum in the European Union. And in France, it's 11%, and by the current partner in Germany, 7%, and by previous partner, 31% in France and 24%. You see, previous partners are more dangerous, particularly when it comes to killings. Why do women underreport? Shame. They feel it's their fault. I'm sorry, I have to say it in these bland words, but that's what we found out, and that's what the literature says. And they feel responsible for the reputation of the family. They feel responsible for the reputation of the partner who abuses them, and they don't think they will get help. What they want is to be listened and talked to, and that is the question if the police is the best we can come up with. I don't think so. Well, that is not so important. Now, what kind of violence do we have? Pushed or shoved. This is always 1 time or 2 to 5 times, slapped in the face, thrown at with a hard object, suffocated, which has a high correlation with homicide and femicide. If a partner suffocates and strangles, the likelihood that the violence escalates into probably finally the lethal area, beaten in the head. You see, these numbers are very high. And this is for our countries. Reporting, 66% of acts did not come to the attention of police. In Germany, it's 15% that come to the attention, and in France, 18%. In the EU average is 20% that comes to the attention, where it is reported. In the UK, 25%. Reporting, you see that's higher to medical doctors, and reporting to police is 14%, so that's lower. So you have more women going to their general practitioner or to a hospital, which we found is peculiar because they don't report to police, even if there's a threat of killing. And they often, the medical doctors do not want to find out what is really happening in the family. And that is the kind of things we found out in our qualitative field studies and interviews. So there we think is room to move, there's space for improvement. We had this, which factors contribute. It's income, alcohol, low income, alcohol consumption, cultural factors. There is a difference between mainstream females and minority females. Incidents of domestic violence are higher in non-mainstream populations. That can have to do with cultural stereotypes of masculinity. Some men actually think they are entitled to physically abuse women and children, and they have to learn that it's not the case. And in Germany, domestic violence is, of course, a crime. And public awareness. This is interesting. The unmet needs of victims. Victims want someone to talk to, and they want protection. That is something that police can do, and they want practical help, something that police cannot do very well. Practical help is feminist organization, victim organizations, women's shelter, and not necessarily police. Police can be gatekeepers to cooperate with advocates for domestic violence, not for domestic violence, but for curbing domestic violence. And the political engagement they can do, they did in some cities. It was very different. In some cities, we had very, very highly skilled officers, men and women, who were experts in domestic violence. They knew the literature, and they had 10, 15 years of experience, and they were training the patrol officers of their district to do a better job. The leadership must make DV used to be something that was sort of family stuff, you know, men beating women. Yeah, it's a family affair. This has changed totally in police, and the change actually came from the United States. Duluth was where police could send the violent partner out of the residence. However, American research says now that this practice is very much to the disadvantage of minority women because they are imprisoned at a higher rate, because they are seen, both partners have been violent, both of them are imprisoned, the children are left alone. It's not running very well. We can cut this short now, because I have more than 45 minutes. Debriefing of critical cases would be a leadership job, taking care of employees' psychological and mental hygiene. And this is often lacking because police leaders have a very high administrative workload. But that can also be used as an excuse, because we have run into police leaders, very high rank, the police chief of Mannheim and Heidelberg, the police chief of Freiburg, who made this their top priority. And that makes a difference. When they say, this is important, folks, you have to do this, and we're going to check this and monitor this, then police change. And the most important is, of course, patrol officers, men and women, and their immediate supervisors. Trustful atmosphere requires strong supervisory support, constructive leadership, and to enable frontline responders to face the challenges of domestic violence interventions in a professional manner. Leaders need to be trained to guard the guardians. That was it. This is where you can read more about the project, www.improdova.eu, European Union, and we have a Twitter account, which I never use because I don't like Twitter. Not for the simple reason that someone whom I really dislike uses it all the time, but because simply I am not a digital. Yeah, my daughter does it. So these are the references. If you want to look at the presentation, you can check out the reference that I have used. I have used many, many others because it has been an area of my work for the last 40 years. Thank you very much, Sabine, for sharing this. How do I get the text of stoppen? Stoppen, good German word, stoppen. Okay.
Thank you, Jochen. Thank you very much for this tour de force in just a half hour, a bit over half hour, to give us so many things to think about. I have a former student who had to leave, but she was very interested, and I also had this question. When you presented the numbers that you say in the United States, there's 750,000 police, and in Germany there's 250,000, which means I mean, that would, Germany is a lot smaller.
Yeah, it's
So you have
very
actually more police in Germany per person than in the US.
yes, we do, and we have even less than the United States in Switzerland and some other European countries. So the rate police per population differs a lot. Germany has, of course, police is not only what I've been talking about, it's also traffic and so on. And like in your country, it's all kinds of things. In a way, it's going back to what it was in the 19th century. It's getting more and more administrative and jobs that are not originally patrol officer jobs. But police is, the police numbers are there. On the other hand, we train them and we give them in-service trainings and we monitor them. That is quite a costly thing. When it comes to costs, I wouldn't know. I haven't checked that. I think the militarization with expensive weaponry has not happened in Germany. This kind of equipment, crazy equipment hype has not happened. They have some equipment and money is spent there, but it's not in the same dimension as in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
See, in Germany, it's always two officers. If you have a domestic dispute, it's two patrol cars with two officers each, one man, often one man, one woman. The first takes care of the victim or the perpetrators. They talk to them and they look if the children are okay. And the second one is backup if there is an escalation.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of a single officer sitting in a police car and getting somewhere is completely alien to our reality of policing. It's always two.
Mm-hmm. That's also, good,
Yeah.
good checks and balances. Another question that I had was about the domestic violence in the incidents being lower in the south of Europe.
Okay.
And I wonder what you've come up with to explain that. I mean, the first thing that came to mind to me is it's warmer. It's warmer. You can go outside. You are not.
They have better food. No, it's
No, I mean you are not. If a situation is tense and escalates, if it's snowing outside, it's much harder to escape. But if you can leave for a few hours and walk around the block, I don't know. That's a silly answer? But what's
no,
your
it's not
explanation?
nothing is silly. Silly is only when you have a monocausal explanation. Say you have factor A, then you have factor B.
Mm.
In the South, and to some extent, family bonds are still stronger. So that is a deterrent because if a husband abuses his wife, he is held accountable by two families.
Mm-hmm.
So you have informal social control. Like you have in Asian societies. I mean, or why is the incidence of domestic violence in the United States the lowest is Jewish communities and Jewish families. It's the lowest of all. Why? Because of inherent cultural traits that have to do with family. It has to do with accountability of family members. They are accountable to the family, and some, of course, other things that they may be more reluctant to use violence. And I think if you look at large parts of Italy, you still have a family structure, and the same is true of Spain. And there is more outdoor, as you say, outdoor activity. But if you look at Berlin right now, I could say since April, well, we have been inside because of Corona. But if you go out now with the restrictions eased, people are on the streets and they are outside, kids play outside and so on. It has to do with the density of population. It has to do also with the social control exercised by the neighborhood, by the neighbors. Mm-hmm. Neighbors are a very important factor. And neighborhood relations are, I think, stronger in the south of Europe than in the north. On the other hand, it's a surprise that Denmark has such a high number, But it is also a question of statistics, which acts are counted and which are not. So to answer this question, I think we are pretty good as cultural anthropologists. Sabine and I saying it has something to do with the climate. With the climate in terms of weather, with the climate of social climate, with the cultural climate.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, when people think twice before they do something bad, it's very often because there's control. It's not because they are inherently completely disciplined, because domestic violence situations are situations where year-long, sometimes decades-long conflicts between two persons escalate and lead to screaming. And I had one incident here on the street. A guy, this is too long to tell, but it was on the street. They were not intimidated by the fact, this is Charlottenburg, people are there sitting outside in restaurants and shopping. They were not intimidated by the fact that about 50 people were there watching them. It was a certainly middle class or upper middle class family, elegant, good, well-dressed, and the girl was crying. So I went to the guy and said, you know, why can't you please stop this? Look, your daughter is crying. She has been crying. Don't you notice? The child is hurting. So that is the kind of intervention that is not successful. It doesn't help them, but they stopped. And then the mother took the girl and they left the scene. The guy was behind them, but he was not approaching them. So me, as having worked with police for such a long time, of course I have this awareness, and if he would have touched her, so I would have probably intervened or called the police. But the neighbors, the community, where there is still a community, plays a very decisive role.
Mm-hmm. We have some questions from others that I don't want to monopolize here. Why don't I start with Sarah? Sarah, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question out loud. I'm just going to have to find you real quick. Okay, here she is. Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great, excellent. Thank you. This was really helpful for me for some research that I'm doing on the Weimar Republic and democratic reform in policing. So, but my question is about contemporary policing and whether the degree of difference in the militarization of the US and the German police is related to the different ways that the two countries have responded to the quote unquote war on terror. Some people have been arguing recently that one of the reasons that the US police are so militarized and are using this military hardware against the domestic population is because there's been so little oversight and programmatic planning on what should and shouldn't be done with this kind of hyper aggressive war style military equipment once it was brought into the police arsenal in the US. So I was wondering if there is a certain picture of the German response to the war on terror that explains the lack of militarization of the police. Thank you.
Very good question, Sarah. Thanks a lot. We avoid the war metaphor. We don't say war on drugs, war on terror, war on this, war on this. That is sort of an American automatism. We had terrible incidents. You remember the Christmas market incident. And ISIS or ISIS-affiliated people are operating. And this is something I'm quite proud of that in the last 10 years, police have detected many of these perpetrators planning something and sort of incapacitated them, but not by killing them, but putting them into prison. But the war metaphor is a very dangerous one. I mean, if you look at the war on drugs, it has completely failed in the United States, totally failed. I mean, and it's still used. And the war on terror is another thing where you can ask: is that the right metaphor to describe what is happening and what has to be done? And I think, Sarah, that I am deeply skeptical that you can stop this. Stop these people who see themselves as soldiers. That's true, and who attack us in civilian life. You can stop them with having military equipment in the police departments. I am deeply skeptical. I think this war on metaphor has a tendency to get things running into a direction which is not conducive to getting the problem solved. So it may be a little bit too harsh to say it that way, but European countries had to fight the war on terror. We had terrible, terrible incidents in Spain. We had them in Italy. We had them everywhere. We had them in the Scandinavian countries. But I think we don't see this as a war. We see this as a policing problem.
Thank you.
Policing is not war. I mean, no, it's not. Policing has to do with civilians. So yeah, that's the best I can come up with.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, we have another question from Judith. I'm going to unmute you, Judith, so you can ask your question. Go ahead. Judith? Oh. Yeah, you just have to unmute yourself on your end, I think.
Oh, I prefer that you ask it.
Oh, okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
All right, so she says, thank you for your excellent presentation on a very timely issue. If policemen view some functions as women's work, as you described, right, in your presentation, how do some of these functions, domestic violence, rape, child abuse, porn, trafficking, get handled? Do you have women police officers, any high-ranking officers?
Traditionally, culturally speaking, patrol militia was a masculinity-oriented male work in our societies. So I'm going back the last 150 years, surely. We have now 25% to 30% of persons entering the police service being female. There is a glass ceiling, but we have police chiefs, female police chiefs. Berlin has a female police chief, and other cities. In the gold star top management section, the percentage is rising, but it's not. It is not close to 50%. It's maybe 20%. In good cases, 20%. The anti female abuse, porn, and so on, the things you mentioned, is done by patrol and by detectives, and there you have men and female. So what I meant to say I meant the cultural stereotypes that underlie certain activities, like cleaning, like doing the same thing again and again and again, and talking to people who are upset, irate, which is like talking to irate 4-year-olds, if you know what I mean, or to 13-year-olds, which is even worse. That kind of caring, repetitive, unrewarded, that's the point. It's not, you get no rewards for that. That is something that sort of challenges the masculinity conceptions of some male, or of many actually, male police officers who want to see themselves as crime fighters. That is, so it's not, don't take what I said as a sort of as a given or something you can prove. It is an interpretation.
Okay.
And for that I have proof. I mean, we have done research in that area. It is exactly, that's why community policing is not so popular among police and is laughed at and made and ridicule put on it. It's because it has this quality of being mother's work, you know, repeating and doing cleaning up again and being patient and controlling yourself and so on. It's just the opposite of the Hollywood depiction of the powerful male law enforcer. You know, this Bruce Willis, Mel Gibson, whatever you name it.
Jochen, I want to go back to something that you invited us to discuss, and that is this issue of structural racism that has been in the news since what's her name, the new SPD, Saskia Esken, the new SPD leader, came out with the accusation that there is latent racism in the ranks of security forces. And I mean, in a way, what you presented sort of justifies that conclusion, right? There is definitely a percentage of people, you say 10 to 15 in the whole population, and that is most likely reflected as well in the police, that is you know, that it has racist ideological tendencies or worse. But I think from what I understand, and there was a Council for European Studies webinar this morning, actually, by 3 African-American experts on racism in Europe. And they were talking about systemic racism as something that is denied in Europe. And whereas in America, you can't deny it because it's, you know, very much present and very, and has been also brought into academia by a number of scholarly works and book publications. And they said that both in France and in Germany and in the UK, the general public and the media and politicians are all saying, no, we don't have institutional racism. We don't have systemic racism. We have racists, and we have racist parties and racist incidents, but we're not, you know, all somehow racist. And what's interesting to me is that they said, well, that denies the history of racism in these countries, the colonial histories, and the histories of othering, the histories of violence, and the parallels. And they drew quite a few parallels between the US and Europe. And they didn't single out Germany. They said that it's similar in Germany, France, and the UK. But I think my understanding is that really they are using the term systemic racism and institutionalized racism very differently from how you define racism when you present these numbers. Would you agree? And is this conversation? I mean, I saw this morning in the German news that the government is now going to do a study of racial profiling.
Yeah, it's the Berlin government is thinking about introducing a law against discrimination, ethnic discrimination, gender discrimination, and so on. Let me put it this way. When there is a train from, let's say, Frankfurt Oder, which is in the very east, to Berlin, one of these regional trains, and federal police officers go in and control only people with dark color of skin. This has been reported in the east, in the west, in the south, in the north. That is discriminatory because they use color of skin as an indicator of otherness. So in my book, that is an act of racism. Why do they do this? This is not to excuse that. They do this because the likelihood of getting someone who has false or no papers or so, and is not allowed to get into Berlin or to stay in Germany, or who has even proceedings against him, mostly him or her, is very high. So it is a successful strategy of someone who is absolutely mindless, or doesn't mind the history of racism and the history of discrimination in my country, your country, in every country, because he does something that is terrible. In front of other passengers, he picks out people with different color of skin. Now, is that structural racism? It is structural racism if the superior leadership does not rule this out and say, we can't do this anymore. It is, even if there are people who are using this train to illegally enter cities and so on. If a search procedure has no immediate cause, it is against the rule of proportionality. It is not appropriate to do this. Now, this is one thing. The definition that I use comes from the Macpherson report. That was London Metropolitan Police after the killing of Stephen Lawrence. They defined institutional racism as the collective failure of police organizations to do what their job is, namely to deal with demands of populations and also of minority populations, to help them, to support them. There is a definition. It's very precise. I didn't learn it by heart, but I liked it because it is a question whether it is not because you have these. I've never believed in the bad apple theory. I think that's a very stupid thing. On the other hand, a bad apple spoils the whole basket, but or in German, it's schwarze Schafe, black sheep. You know, black sheep are completely peaceful. I've seen them in Switzerland, in the farms. They don't do anything. But the question is, when these things happen, how are they monitored? And how does the immediate and the upper leadership react to it? How does the police organization react to it? Do they create seminars? Do they do teaching? Do they do surveys? The fact that there are no surveys in Germany and also not in the United States tells us that there is not enough interest in this area, political interest. Systemic, or as Frau Esken said, structural racism is, it has been criticized by people who are very critical of police. In the last 25 police scholars or criminology scholars, they thought Frau Esken's what we call in German pauschal, you know, it's sort of a generalization, which also feeds into a stereotype. It feeds into the stereotype that police cannot really do a good job and cannot really take care of people. And that, I think, is wrong, because as we speak, they are finding children, they are helping elderly people, they are solving traffic accidents, they are keeping guys racing their Porsches down the Kurfürstendamm. They are doing this and that. They're taking care of things, of everyday life worries and issues. Policing is mostly serving citizens. And you can do this well, and you can do this in a bad way. But putting this kind of accusation across the mass of 250,000 men and women, out of which 20, 25, sometimes 30% are women, saying they are structurally racist, that is, for me, it's outrageous. You know? I'm sorry, I have no other word for that. And this is a politician who has never really done much work in that area. She's not qualified. She's not an interior security specialist. It's just, let me put it that way. The Social Democrats have a lot of problems right now, and the kind of media attention you get for something like that is something that makes your name pop up in the media. Germans are, I include myself, when I am accused of being racist, and it really, I think about this for a week. My Australian friend has accused me because of a video clip that I sent to him. Said he doesn't laugh about it because it's racist. It was not racist, but it was just very funny. But it was using ethnicity to make fun, language. But racism in terms of against Black people, against people from minorities, against Jewish people, against Sinti and Roma, I'm sorry, I have no humor. It has to be proven. If it says a practice is racist, I'm the first one to look at it and say, okay, this is a racist practice. And I have spent, since 1994, I started teaching as a professor. I have spent hours and hours and talked to many and supervised theses to do something against racism in German police. And somebody stands up and says, German police is structurally racist. It really upsets me. And
well,
it does upset police officers, I can tell you, it upsets them deeply because I have done field studies in cities where you have these problems, and I can tell you that they try, sometimes what we call Eselsgeduld, it's the patience of a donkey, to solve problems and to understand and so on, to use empathy. That is all flattened out.
I understand, and I appreciate your describing this, and of course the numbers of incidents of fatalities from police, for example, that are so low clearly show that there is a big difference between what's happening in the US and in Germany. At the same time, I am, of course, also listening to Black Germans, Turkish Germans, scholars who are studying, the experience of being Black in Germany today, of being Muslim in Germany today, of being minority in Germany today. And if you sit in that train and you see a policeman and you know that you are going to be more likely to be searched or to be questioned than the
ask for your ID.
Right. I mean, then that is the experience from your perspective of structural racism, right? And I think, I always think about Volkswagen and its outrageous scandal against everyone in the world, and how they lied and they went all the way to the chancellor's office to make sure that nothing happened, right? And it took the diligence of some prosecutors to actually start moving, and still it's difficult because and no one on that train who looks like a typical Volkswagen executive would have to worry that the police will ask them what they've done, right? And all the people who don't pay their taxes and who put their money in tax havens, they are not getting caught. And in a way,
Well,
you feel like
we are working on it. We
Yeah.
are working on it, but
I just feel like I can understand that if you're yourself identify as a minority in Germany, that you feel like the police is coming to your neighborhood more often, in part because it's easier for them to catch someone doing something than it is for them to catch white collar
Sabine, they
criminals.
don't like to go into certain neighborhoods. They are there because the neighbors call, because the children call, because the mother calls, because violence is happening, and so on. And people, we had these incidents where police cars were attacked, where officers were physically attacked, and so on. Now, see, let me put it this way. I'm a sociologist, so structure is for me more than one or two or three. Structure, I use structure because if you have right-wing support networks in the police, that is something that is an indication of a structure beginning to build, and then you have to take care of that and eradicate that and chuck the people out who do this, the officers. And that has been done. It has been done, but it has not been done sufficiently because new evidence pops up of officers behaving this way, of networks, of chat groups, and so on. So there is something that is growing there. I look at this like somebody who's specializing in cancer. You look at this, you see this, and you have to act. Now, the problem is there are two ways of acting. One is to fight it and to eradicate this, which is good. On the other hand, when we look at inappropriate behavior, I don't mean criminal offenses or police abuse or misconduct. I mean things in everyday life. We need to establish institutions and places like police oversight, restorative justice, whatever, where police officers can, because I've read that in the chat, you cannot say, I'm sorry. This is not when you have killed someone or beaten someone to pulp, but if you have used physical force unnecessarily, there must be a way between the citizen and the police officer to discuss this with a third person present, and you have to have an institution with somebody leading it, who is preferably a German Richter, qualified for a judge's position, where young officers can go and say, I've observed this in my precinct, I've observed this in my patrol group. There is this kind of thing that we don't have that. And why don't we have it? Because the police leadership and the political leadership, and because the unions think this is der Sündenfall, this is the worst thing that can happen. This is control of police. They are incapacitated. This is complete nonsense, because every experience in other countries shows that you can have better policing when you have a valve for dealing with the problems there are. If somebody's killed by police or somebody's beaten, and this is put on video, it has to be criminal investigation. And because in Germany, the consequences of misbehavior of public officers, of police officers, are so grave, the Schwelle, the barrier to report my partner is very, very high, because I may need him tomorrow to protect me. There are these kinds of things that are much more subtle, and you have to do much more political change than to sort of just use a slogan. Structural racism is when a collective failure on the part of police is there to protect people, to serve their job, and to help people. If it's a collective failure, collective denial, and so on, that is structural. But what we have is not harmless. It is not harmless at all. But the term structural racism has the problem that it creates an entity which is not there. You don't see the points where you can have, where you can start with change, where you can address people, where you can address problems. And this is what I have done since '94. And many, many others, I would say at least 50, 60, 70 German academics have been worked. That Turks feel over-policed, I understand, and because partly it's true, but partly it's, you know, my good friend and colleague, Raphael Baer, who was an ex-cop and who's now a professor, he says, respect is not a one-way street. And if you look at the behavior in the areas in Berlin and in Frankfurt and elsewhere, we have certain population, certain young men on the streets. Okay, the apartments are too small to stay inside, and so on and so on. There is a lack of respect on the part of the population who has been supported and helped by police. And they have no, this is a generalization again, but it's not so easy to understand this. You have to study this, and you have to try to change this. And then to say, oh, this is structural racism. That's gone. Full stop. That's it. Can't change anything. I don't think they're doing themselves a favor by using these terms without knowing what they're talking about.
Well, it certainly suggests that there has to be a kind of conversation across these differences, right? I think there needs to be better understanding of what definition and where the definition makes sense and how it should evolve. I was thinking also when you because you started out by showing the dangerous overlap that led to a merger basically during the Nazi era of police and military force, right? Or the SS. And that reminded me that there was this report last week of the KSK, was it
that's the military,
right, military unit,
yeah,
where they found extreme right-wing tendencies, and that's something that
and weapons and ammunition and
right.
plans. What happens when the revolution, not the left-wing revolution, but the right-wing revolution starts? Yes, I think probably, given that this is a much smaller number of soldiers, specially trained elite soldiers, and given the size of city departments, I would be not very surprised if you can find cases in the police where that is the same. But we have things now that was in the media, I think 2 weeks ago, that 3 foot patrol officers have reported their higher ranking supervisors for racist behavior to the brass, to the leadership. Mm-hmm. We need more of that kind of behavior. We need more, particularly young police coming out of the colleges. They have law, they have psychology, they have learned de-escalation strategies, and they still, when they step outside, they are hit in the face by the reality that they encounter. Mm-hmm. And they're monitoring. When you make bad experiences with certain populations, it is a human thing that you form stereotypes and generalizations. You think somebody is different and has this kind of behavior that is difficult and that threatens me. You then think that each and every person who looks like that is the same. That's why I said having ex-Iraq and Syria soldiers in the urban police service may be very difficult and dangerous idea. And the number of complaints, for example, in Boston, is much higher against the ex-soldiers than police that were trained in civilian careers. To cut it short, as you see, this is something that is not close to my heart, but I don't like generalizations, neither for people, nor for people from certain groups, nor anything, but also not for professions. So I find looking at wherever racism happens in clusters, to speak of racist structures is okay, but structural racism is something that is you can't heal it. You can't. There's no therapy for it. It's structural. The Nazis police there wasn't enough cleansing after 45, 50, but it slowly came out. Courts started to work. There was investigations, and more of these former Nazi officers who were involved in atrocities were detected, and they were charged. And but the spirit of authoritarianism, of German Gehorsam, of chain of command, of the importance of uniform, that kind of spirit, which was there also in the Weimar Republic and in the Kaiserreich, but it was sort of exponential during the Nazi time, that spirit prevailed. And that is something when I find that police officer or cops sort of use that as whatever the intention, as something to identify with, then I think that is an act of racism, of Nazism, that has to be sanctioned and public and sanctioned, and there have to be disciplinary measures, or officers have to be kicked out, which is another problem, because if you get a sentence longer than 11 months by the court, that is the only way you can be really sacked. If you get a sentence of 11 months on probation, regardless of what you have done, you can still stay in the force. These kinds of things are, you see, it's actually a cluster of all things that sort of are interconnected with each other, and that makes it so difficult to have better police and better policing. And why these old things, okay, there are no more Nazis in the police, but they have been cases where they have played with swastikas, where they have identified with that kind of spirit, and that for me is much more upsetting than a politician using the word of structural racism. And I really suffer.
My suspicion is that what you're describing and what they're describing is actually not that far apart. But I have one of my students said, how can we demand minorities to respect authority when they are being oppressed? To ask them to respect authority is to silence the concerns of the minority population. I want to combine that with the question of what is the percentage of police that are themselves minority? That
has been rising in the last, there are some Länder, I have explained what the Länder are, that are below the number of sort of representativeness, but there are some, like Niedersachsen, for example, and I think to some extent Hamburg, the city-states, Berlin is still below 10%, although we have many, many more people of migrant background. There are more and more, and I think it is sort of plus minus in the 10%. 13% would be representative, and Niedersachsen, Lower Saxony has a higher representation of officers with a migrant background. Let me go back to something you said. Of course, I don't know how many people did come to Germany, 1.3 million or so that could cross the border. Now, if you tell me with the things that were done, the education programs, the language programs, the housing, I mean, they were housed in buildings, but now there's more and more that they're housed individually. Of course, it's not luxury housing. Frau Merkel didn't promise them a villa with a swimming pool. but it is, they are not treated in any way as or oppressed in a structural way. That is simply not true. My country has, I mean, that was one of the few moments where I think, although I also had some doubts that this would work out, but if you look at the crime numbers, if you look what police publishes about this, there are actually either not there or so much lower than what was predicted by the right wing and by the xenophobic. Also, we have media now, the populists. You know, I'm not going to tell you about populism because you're suffering as a whole country from it. If you look at that, and if you look at all the Germans who have been doing working with the kids so that they can achieve something in school, the schooling, the teachers, and so you look at these things, and you also look how often police has been helpful to people from the new arrivals, I call them. And then I think an argument saying how can oppressed people have any trust in police? I find that a little bit too oberflächlich, superficial. I can appreciate it, but the fact is, of course, that mainstream white Germans, like mainstream white Americans, are not overly concerned with having empathy and being active to better the lives of those who are on the lower ranks of society. I would say that that is true for both of our countries. But if you look like
also just had the numbers, I think that also came out yesterday or today, that COVID patients in hospitals are more likely going to be lower income, right?
Yes, that is true. But you would expect if the housing conditions were subhuman or anything like the guest workers in the 50s and 60s who came to Germany, the way they were housed was the former concentration camp barracks, you know, that kind of stuff we don't have anymore. But there was housing in accommodations that were stuffed with people, the families and so on. You would expect really high numbers of outbreak of the virus, and that was not the case. And of course, we have to look at the fatal developments, which are older people here. But if you look at the proportion of African Americans who caught infections and who were then sent to hospital and who died, I think fortunately that didn't happen here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
if you go into a hospital now, if you go into, even if you're an old, white, grumpy guy like me, you go into Charité Mitte or Charité Wedding, the number of nurses, of doctors, of surgeons, of high-ranking medical staff who have different color of skin and who come from different countries is something that you cannot deny. But what I said, the nursing staff, the 24-hour staff in the cities, in the hospitals, they are more likely in Germany to be Turkish or migrant or from countries, and they are underpaid, and that is the same in your country. And if we want social change, it's not only the police. Okay, the police is very urgent in the US, but we also need to change these things. We need to get these people into jobs, and we need to give them a life that is worth living so that they don't feel suppressed. I think they feel often more suppressed by the fact that they cannot buy things, that they cannot send their kids in school with the necessary money for an excursion to the zoological garden, or that they cannot buy their sons the Nike shoes. That is on a daily basis something that they may experience as suppression. It is not actively by the uniformed policewoman coming around the corner. I think oppression has many facets, and one of them is economical, and that is a very important one. And if there is no intention on the part of the white mainstream to change that, then the situation gets more and more serious. Okay.
Right. Yes, I know. We have so many more things that we could talk about in that context, and I really thank you for doing this after dinner, late in the evening. Thank you so much, Jochen. hope we can bring you back for real when things get
I
normal
was,
again.
I was gonna say the same
get
thing.
more
Although
normal.
I'm in the risk group, there was this one chat of a person said she was there when we did this thing together. I hope that we'll see her there and have a cup of coffee with her. No, seriously, I am grateful because Brandeis is a famous place. I mean, it's Horkheimer and other things that came from that university. And I have really enjoyed to go there and always found the audience very responsive, critical. It's a pity with online stuff. You know, if I see faces, I can see much better. The structural racism thing, I was carried away. I'm sorry, but if I see faces, I wouldn't do that. I just saw your face, and yours was critical enough, Sabine.
That's my job. Well, I hope people can come back again on Thursday when we will certainly continue this conversation about race with Sasha and Rebecca and Ariane and Guy, and then next Monday we will talk about climate change. So thank you again, Joachim. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Bye bye, Sabine. Bye bye.
Stop.
You want me to stay?